Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the curator of public programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. We're so pleased that you've joined us today or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. The Fowler is honored to present today's program marking the opening of Particular Histories, Provenance Research in African Arts, with exhibition curator Carlee S. Forbes. Carlee will consider the works on view alongside additional examples drawn from this Mellon-funded project. She'll be elucidating how African objects featured in the exhibition moved from their places of creation to communities and countries near and far. Carlee S. Forbes is the Memorial Fellow at the Fowler, where she researches African objects donated by the Wellcome Trust to the museum in 1965. Forbes received her PhD in art history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's worked with the Ackland Art Museum, the North Carolina Museum of Art, and the Samuel P. Harn Museum of Art. Her research focuses on art produced during the colonial period in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, museum and collecting histories and issues of provenance. Before we get going, I have just a few quick technical bits of housekeeping. Once the screen sharing begins, I encourage you to click view options at the top of your screen and then select side-by-side mode so the video feed doesn't cover any of our presentation. And if you have any questions during our program, please do submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit entries that you would like to be considered to be answered at the end of the program. All right, that's all from me. Over to you, Carlee.
Great, thanks, Bianca. This is not presenting. There we go. All right, well, thanks everyone for being here with us today from time zones all over the globe. We're really excited to share this program with you. Diving right in, this exhibition is about provenance, which in its most basic definition is the history of ownership of an object, valued belonging, or artwork. Provenance research traces works from the place and time of its creation through subsequent ownerships. Now, you may have seen provenance mentioned in other contexts, such as tracing of previous owners to return Nazi-era looted possessions, and recently in the growing attention on the return of works to formerly colonized nations. By looking at specific instances of provenance histories for African material, this exhibition begins a process of reckoning with the legacy of European colonization and its influence on objects' perceived use and evolving notions of worth in European and American collections, as well as provides an integral first step in building connections with communities in which these works were made and used. While explaining these provenance histories, this exhibition is also about research process. Particular Histories emerges from a 3-year initiative focused on the provenance of African material that came to the Fowler in the 1960s from the collection of Sir Henry Wellcome. Thanks to generous funding from the Mellon Foundation, I have been part of a Fowler team that has been employing a combination of conservation, material science, archival research, and curatorial methods to consider this material from the Wellcome Trust. The Provenance Research on View features 5 case studies drawn from this larger project. So what about the objects themselves? Upon the gift's arrival in 1965, the works deemed the masterpieces were included in an exhibition and publication celebrating the gift's arrival. And since then, several of these featured objects have reappeared again and again in subsequent Fowler projects. Yet a majority of the over 7,000 African works in the gift have remained in collections and received little attention. The goal of our project has been to consider these works and to think about the collection as a whole. Our project has sought to consider many different ways of thinking about the objects, their materiality, and their histories. So to do so, we thought about collection records, which I will discuss in more detail momentarily. We also sought out other archives, including auction catalogs, observed material evidence, such as stickers, and conducted material analysis, such as the portable X-ray fluorescence seen in use here. And we also communicated with scholars and community members across the globe, all in an effort to gain the fullest understanding about the works and their movements. To show our activities and workflows throughout the gallery and in the digital resources, as a visitor, you will be invited into our research practice, where we identify the many challenges of reconstructing a work's provenance, including when its history has been lost or even omitted from past records. One challenge of conducting provenance research has been to move beyond the simple construction of a list of owners. Take, for example, Henry Wellcome and the Wellcome Trust. Now, I've mentioned these names several times already, but to provide a little more detail, Henry S. Wellcome co-founded Burroughs Wellcome and Company, an enormous pharmaceutical company that supplied Europe and its colonial territories with all kinds of medicines and medical equipment in the early 20th century. Such a venture earned Wellcome an immense fortune. He then spent several decades using this fortune to collect an almost unfathomable number of things. The care and management of his collection necessitated that he hire staff, which only grew over time as he constructed the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum to display the collection. Wellcome's holdings started off with a defined focus relating to the history of medicine as indicated by the name of his museum. But over time, his interests expanded and his collection came to include books, manuscripts, paintings, classical sculpture, medical equipment, archaeological material, tools, weapons, global arts, and many other categories of material culture, really anything, prior to his death in 1936. Upon his death, the newly formed Wellcome Trust held a series of dispersals, mostly to UK-based institutions to dismantle the collection. The gift to the Fowler in the 1960s was one of the last of such dispersals and was foundational to our institution. So we can merely see Wellcome as part of the list of the owners of an object, but when we look deeper at the complexity of Wellcome and his endeavors, we must remember that his business and his collecting activities were part of a distinct era of the late 19th and early 20th century, when increasingly violent and intrusive colonial endeavors resulted in the removal of material from communities all over the world that was then acquired by European and American private and public owners. In thinking about Wellcome's commercial endeavors, his collecting and his staff, we come to see the complexity of lived experiences within a larger global political, cultural, social, and economic system. Thus, this provenance research goes beyond just a name and comes to include a whole host of background information that influences the way we understand these objects. It's through this kind of extensive provenance research that we can discuss several larger themes. First, examining the cultural, economic, and political context through which something moves. Second, studying this movement between locations and owners sheds light on the various actors who have intersected with and affected an object's trajectory. Third, considering these actors reveals aspects of collecting patterns of individuals and institutions, which finally sheds light on shifting perceptions of the work's value. So how do we arrive then at these complex background stories? Along with the gift of objects, the Wellcome Trust also sent archival information. Throughout the exhibition, you will see this archival material placed alongside the objects. Most of this in the form of 4x6-inch note cards called flimsy cards. These cards contain a lot of information, but please be advised that they may also contain outdated and offensive language that is indicative of the time of their creation in the early 20th century. So let's begin here with a single example. As you can see, these cards seemingly contain not very much, but when you really dive deep, it's a lot of information. Much of this information was not previously noted or understood in our internal records prior to this project, so our first task was to record everything we could. Let's break down this card together. First, we have examples of the alphanumeric numbering system used in Wellcome's collection for the ease of identifying each work and for record keeping. Knowing at least one of these numbers helps us to search Wellcome's archives, which thankfully are all digitized right now, for further information. The two kinds of numbers are an R, or registration number, seen here at the top, which correlates to a registration log. Beginning in 1913, Wellcome's Historical Medical Museum staff assigned entering objects with an R registration number. This ran consecutively until May of 1933 and registered 60,514 works. A new system then started in 1935, like we see here, with the R number followed by the registration year. So this was the 823rd object registered in 1937, and then the numbering system would start over the next year. The other kind of number is the accession number, as we see here in the center of the card. This system started in 1929 and corresponds to the flimsy card archive. Remember here, a flimsy card is the 4x6-inch cards like we see here. On the upper right, we have a unique identifier for the work within the Fowler's collection. All of our accession numbers begin with an X, followed by the year of acquisition, in this case, 1965, followed by the unique identifier within that acquisition. So this piece was number 9,241 of Welcome's Gift in 1965. These numbers help us keep track of the object, all of its parts, and its corresponding records. The card's center is largely devoted to a physical description, dimensions, and possible place of creation. At the bottom of the card, we have a coded set of information related to the place and time when Welcome acquired the work. First, FOS is an abbreviation that stands for Messrs. Foster, an auction house in London. Then we see the auction date. For our US-based audiences, we must remember when looking at the cards that the date order is different from what most of us are used to. It goes day/month/year. So here it is, November 26, 1931. We then have the auction lot number and the name of the Welcome staff responsible for the purchase. And finally, on the lower left, we see a handwritten note. As we trace provenance, it's also important to consider how meaning or interpretation changes over time. Thanks to some archive comparisons and handwriting analysis, we know that this note is from Fowler curator Ralph C. Altman. As you can see, these cards provide a lot of information that has been helpful as we research provenance. That being said, this isn't the case for every object. You see this axe here, which is included in the exhibition. Rather than the neatly composed flimsy card, this work has only a yellow slip of paper, hastily written to state no card, no number, nothing. South African ? Axe. This card is an example of the kind that Fowler catalogers compose in the absence of a flimsy card upon the work's arrival to Los Angeles. So here we have a notation of the Fowler number, but an indication that there's not really much to go on from that. Another instance that we have is like this card for a headrest. Here you see the notation at the bottom of the card, N/P, meaning no particulars, signifying that the purchasing information had been lost while at the Welcome collection. The no particulars notation is what inspired our exhibition's title. Rather than no particulars, meaning nothing to go from, this show is all about the particular histories that we can know from many different kinds of research, untangling how these histories fit into larger narratives about the histories of collecting, value, authenticity, and the circulation of work in the 20th century. Because as you can already tell from this overview, we have a lot of information to share from the past 3 years. Each object in the exhibition also has, or will soon have, an accompanying digital resource called a story map that provides a much longer explanation of our methods, more contextual information, and bibliographic references. These story maps are available in the gallery via a monitor, or you can use your personal device to load the QR code or link. We've also shared the link here if you'd like to check them out prior to your visit or on your own time. So now with our background information and methods established, we can move into the specific sections of this display. To frame the very large and abstract ideas about what provenance research can reveal, this exhibition is structured into 3 thematic zones. First, military personnel and collecting, a section which focuses on the implications of European efforts to disenfranchise African communities, often through violence and the seizure of possessions. Many of our audience members today may be familiar with provenance research related to the works taken in the 1897 British raid on Benin City. The Benin City case is a remarkably well-documented incident with the names of participants, registration logs, and accompanying photos. The case study here is meant to demonstrate what work is necessary when we lack this kind of documentation. Sometimes research can fill missing gaps in the history, but other times we are left with supposition. The second section considers 2 notions that are often at play in museum classification and art markets: value and authenticity. Value may include multiple meanings. It is both monetary worth as well as a cultural or art historical significance. And authenticity is a socially constructed concept that relates to value and often also relates to the originality of a work. In this section, we see how classification as inauthentic or tourist art has obscured the histories of artistic innovation and how an imagined history built up a sense of worth. Finally, in thinking about provenance, we see how works shift in meaning and significance as they move through many markets. Through each new location or owner, the meaning can shift from commission, religious object, souvenir, war loot, scientific specimens, curiosity, or artwork, or somewhere in between. We can also identify physical changes as works pass through many markets. Thus, this section also has a deep focus on material study. Each section uses provenance to examine the objects through a different lens. Research on the history of ownership can reveal aspects of colonial era relationships, demonstrate physical movement, and illuminate shifts in meaning or interpretation. Through each step, we highlight information that has been lost or obscured as works change hand and gather new interpretations. Thus, while simultaneously narrating provenance, this is also an exhibition about research that illuminates and redirects conversations about collection histories. So let's take a look at a few of these examples in more detail. Again, I caution here throughout these case studies, I will be drawing on early 20th century archival material, and this may include sensitive, outdated, offensive language or imagery. The first section examines military personnel and collecting and features a single wooden mask surmounted with two long projections, a quadruped covered in spots, grasping a snake that wraps around the mask circumference, and a female figure facing the back. In this section, we consider the circumstances under which the mask left West Africa. There's no denying the violent nature of European efforts to disenfranchise and subdue African communities, and this example seeks to situate the mask within this context. As with most cases, we begin here with the card. In this card, we have welcome numbers, a mask type, a possible region of collection, a note that it was taken during a British military raid, that it was purchased at a Stevens auction, also in London, on November 28, 1911, but no lot number, and a note that had been repaired, likely at the Fowler, since most of these handwritten notes appeared after the gift arrived. In addition to looking at the flimsy card, we conducted a close physical examination of each object. In this case, we found several things that may help our provenance research. First is a coded identification, SL45 and 2, that's been written in a thin black pigment on the underside of the mask. Second, we see Denton in all caps written in a thick black pigment. I invite you when you come to the exhibition to take a look inside this mask and view these inscriptions for yourself. So one is at the very back and one is at the right side of the mask on the interior. Thanks to the careful work of our conservator and our prep team, we've been able to lift the mask and allow for a view inside. So now we work on trying to piece all this information together. The flimsy card records that the mask was sold at a London auction November 28, 1911, but recall that there was no lot number. However, we do have that SL45 written on the interior. And looking at the auction catalog from the November date, we see that the description of, quote, mask surmounted by figure holding leopard, all cut out of one piece of wood, used by chief mourners at a funeral ceremony taken during an RO expedition. For lot number 45 matches the mask at hand. However, here's where it gets a little scattered and confusing. You can see here in the lot descriptions for lot number 45, 46, and 47, the descriptions mention an action taken against the Ashanti in 1898. Now, typically historians refer to the RO expedition as a 1900 to 1901 British raid against Nigerian communities rather than against the Ashanti in Ghana, which was then called the Gold Coast. So we're a bit confused here at where this is taking place, when it's taking place. However, we begin to consider that this mask style is typical of that produced in Nigeria. Thus, it seems more likely that it did come from this region. So then continuing with the hypothesis that this mask came out of Nigeria around 1900 with the RO expedition, and using the second inscription, Denton, to guide our inquiry, it seems likely that our collector is George C. Denton, who served as a colonial secretary in Lagos from 1888 until his transfer to the Gambia in 1900. As you will see in the story map, there are several instances of Denton and his wife's collections at other institutions. Additionally, we note that Denton retired in 1911 and returned from the Gambia to the UK, perhaps not coincidentally the same year that this mask appeared at auction. Of course, a lot of this is riding on supposition, which is one of the many challenges of our research process. Another ongoing frustration is the lack of clear information about the conditions under which possibly Denton acquired the mask. On one hand, we've noted that there are a number of structural breaks or cracks in the mask's wood. In this image, you can see that there are breaks on the female figure's wrists, 2 breaks on the leopard's back, and 1 on the snake. Fowler conservators analyzed these cracks in order to determine whether they happened before or after the mask left Nigeria. but because such information could influence our understanding for the reason of the mask's departure, as it was frequent practice in Nigerian communities to replace masks that were broken, worn out, or outdated. Thus, if the breaks had occurred in Nigeria, it may have been caused to sell or trade the mask. Unfortunately, it's not possible to determine when these breaks occurred, so back to the drawing board. Yet, on the other hand, we also know that Denton participated in military expeditions, including the now well-discussed raid on Benin City in 1897, resulting in the looting of objects from African communities. So we're left to question, is Denton looting this object? Is he acquiring it from coercion? Is it something that's broken that was sold to him or given? We still don't know. One big lead and possibility for next steps is to contact the descendants of the makers to see if there's any recollection of this type or style or even this mask itself. Stylistic analysis in comparison with similar works suggests that this is a mask by the Esugui workshop in Abeokuta, Nigeria. You can see a similar mask from the Cleveland Museum of Art on the screen here, both with two long projections, a fierce quadruped, and a woman facing the back. We do know that Denton spent time in Abeokuta, and it's possible that he did collect the mask there. So with this mask, we have the opportunity to discuss so much contextual information, but with the caveat that much of it is based on what we see as logical leaps between types of concrete information. This is the reality of much of our provenance research, where key pieces of information have been lost, omitted, or never even recorded in the first place. We may never know how exactly Denton acquired this mask, but it's understanding his collecting activities and actions as an administrator that provide helpful clues as we continue to try to move forward. Moving on to an example from the value and authenticity section, we come to one of my favorite works from the whole project. This tableau of cast brass figures arranged on a wooden board seems to depict a procession similar to those described in accounts of annual customs. A multi-day affair that included displays of royal power, military force, material riches, and spiritual continuity in the Dahomey Kingdom and what is today the Republic of Benin. You can see the figures are cast in a number of expressive poses and carry various items, giving the work an overall sense of movement and dynamism. The archive card for the work is the one that we broke down earlier, and it seems pretty straightforward. We see the Foster's auction information, description, identification of style belonging to the Dahomey Kingdom, and the curator's note further clarifying the work is coming from the capital in Abomey. What is remarkable about this work is that in spite of its composition and artistry, this genre rarely goes on display because of its classification as an object made for export or tourist art. So how did we arrive at this classification? Oral histories from Dahomey, collected from Dahomey Guild members in the 1930s and 50s, recount that the small cast brass figures, such as those seen here, were the innovation of the artist named Gunasunu, who was a member of the guild specializing in blacksmithing and precious metal work for the Dahomey court. Gunasunu used the casting skills acquired in the guild to create a new form of small polished brass figures. We also know that the same artist was coerced or invited, some situation, to come to Marseille in France for the 1906 Exposition Coloniale, where he sold his innovative small cast figures to European exhibition visitors. Upon returning to Dahomey, he continued to make and sell these sculptures, which become popular export items. For example, we see here in 1922 from the Colonial Exposition in Marseille, with other examples appearing in the 1924-25 British Empire exhibition at Wembley. So we see them again and again at these Empire exhibitions. Historically, when works had no local African use or audience, they were categorized in European and American markets as tourist art, somewhat appreciated for their aesthetic qualities, but not considered authentic enough to be representative of Dahomey court artistry. Thus, we see that they had some value, but not enough to merit attention. However, we know that this new style had a long-lasting impact and was also taken up by other artists. For example, a similar tableau was gifted to President John F. Kennedy, and we see how these cast figures also even eventually came to oscillate between local and non-local markets. As we see on the right here, artists have incorporated comparable cast figures into locally used religious objects like asen, which is an altar or memorial structure. Thus, while the tableaus may have initially been made largely for non-African buyers, we can also see how the cast figures began to appeal to many different audiences. By giving this work slow, careful attention and allowing for interpretations beyond its simply made for export nature, we gain a more nuanced understanding of the work. Sure, guild artists may have initially made this type of sculpture for sale to non-African markets, but their presence at an exhibition in France provides opportunities to discuss artist mobility and innovation for new markets, as well as the ultimate return and adaptation of the cast figures into locally used forms. Thus, this once underappreciated genre becomes an incredible lens for discussing all kinds of other issues, in addition to highlighting dynamic artistry. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the second example in this section. You can, of course, see it in the exhibition, the soon-to-be-released story maps, or you can refer to the Lunch and Learn given by Erica P. Jones last summer. The recording is available on the Fowler website. What I can preview is that this is an interesting case of invented provenance, seeming to give the piece a more storied background and higher worth. So our final section brings us back to the question of markets. How provenance research can narrate shifting meanings as works move and the material modifications that may cause or reflect such movements. I'll turn our attention to this carved wooden post. For our frequent visitors, you may recognize this work from its previous installation in the Fowler's Intersections exhibit, where it was included in a display of Yoruba architectural elements. This post was also included in the Fowler's 1965 exhibition, highlighting selections from the Wellcome Trust gift. You can see it here in this image from UCLA's special collections of LA Times photographs, just peeking behind that man. Prior to its arrival, we know from the flimsy card that the post came from a Mr. Isles of Bristol, purchased by Wellcome employee Charles Thompson. We know a little bit more about the post and Isles from a 1925 letter that Thompson wrote to Wellcome. In it, Thompson discusses Isles Pub, the Queen's Head pub in Bristol, and the collection of objects that were, quote, laid out like a museum in the pub's upper rooms. Thompson writes that Isles himself journeyed to Nigeria and Congo, acquiring some works along the way, while others in the collection were purchased by Isles' father from people coming through the busy Bristol port. Thanks to Thompson's records, I was able to locate the pub's former location in Bristol and determine that Isles' first name was Isaac. But beyond that, the provenance goes frustratingly cold. We don't know if Isles purchased this post during his trip to Nigeria, or if it was part of his father's collection, or the name of any other possible collector. It could have been a merchant, soldier, missionary, or any other person coming back from Nigeria. What we can try to follow up on is the burned area on the two figures at the bottom of the post. So you see it here pictured even in the 1925 photograph. The burn marks seem to indicate that this piece was in a fire, but the structural damage appears to be minimal and contained to a shallow surface level. Nonetheless, such a fire could have damaged the post's structural integrity to support a veranda, like the post seen in context here. So the piece may have been decommissioned, much like the mast, in order to pay for a new sculpture. So while we've added some to the history of this wooden post to have determined a little bit more about Isles, it is frustrating to confront how little we know in terms of how the object left Nigeria and the markets it circulated in prior to its arrival in Bristol. The historical provenance research seems to come to a screeching halt with Isaac Isles. Speaking with community members and historians in Southwest Nigeria could present many more opportunities for collaboration and further inquiry, particularly in terms of understanding the practicalities of the post-production. Who would have commissioned it? Who paid for it? Are there any notes on the carving style or pigments? We include this post as a reminder that, like the axe and the headrest mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, provenance research can have a lot of dead ends. These challenges force us to consider the consequences of early 20th century collecting practices and seek new avenues for considering the futures of these objects. So moving along again, for the sake of time, I will skip over a discussion of the gold weights and encourage you to attend our program focused on them in August. On a personal note, these small works have been truly challenging and an exciting part of our process, and I look forward to sharing them with you in the future. So to conclude our program this evening, I want to encourage you, if you are available, to please come and see us in person. So much of the research is based on the visual characteristics of these works. Indeed, here you are seeing the gold weights in the post at nearly the same size, when in actuality, the post stands over 5 feet and the weights can all fit in the palm of my hand. I also invite you to check out the story maps and to really dive into these research processes with us. After all, Provenance is more than just a series of owners, but rather, as we have shown through this exhibition, the research process as a whole and the research project as a whole. Provenance serves as a lens through which we can interrogate colonial era systems, highlight many different actors, and consider the many interpretations of African material received from the Wellcome Trust. Now, to end here, of course, no exhibition opens without an entire team of people. So we've got the Mellon research team, consists of a large portion of the Fowler staff and includes Erica Jones, Marcy Burton, Kate Anderson, Rachel Rayner, Izzy Kelly Ramirez, Jeanette Saunders, Gassi Armenian, Christian DeBear, and Matthew Robb, as well as colleagues and collaborators from all over the globe. So we really thank you for all of your input to the program, to the whole project as a whole. Additionally, the process of putting together this exhibition, including thinking about the text, design, programs, and schedule, pulled in nearly everyone else at the Fowler, making this exhibition a true manifestation of teamwork. And it's with much thanks to everyone at the Fowler and everyone who worked tirelessly to present this exhibition that has a short checklist, but a long list of ideas. I give so many thanks to you all. We hope that you enjoy the exhibition and look very much forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlee. Oh, wow, that was really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing your research with us today. As a reminder, we are welcoming audience questions through the Q&A portal at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please go ahead and submit a question if you haven't already. And Carlee, I'm just really impressed by how you're really required to be such an art sleuth in this capacity. And just please accept my thanks for doing this important work to untangle these histories. Because you've got such minimal information and it's really impressive to see the work that you're doing. And your exhibition is it's so beautifully and smartly installed. And I really hope that anyone in our audience today who is local will take the chance to see your show in situ while it's up at the museum through November, right?
Yeah, through November. I really love that we were able to get the archives into the exhibition alongside the artwork. So a few of them are covered by placards to kind of indicate that they might have that sensitive language, but you can feel free to flip them up. And we're really trying to invite our audiences here into the research process. So a big part of that was to include all the information that we have, which is also why we created these story maps. So if you ever get lonely for archives, we got them in droves and we're happy to share. Yeah.
All right, so we do have a question. We have some questions rolling in right now. Great. So, okay. So, do you have a particularly favorite piece that you recommend folks take a closer look at when they're visiting in person?
That's a great question. Someone asked me that the other day, and they are all my favorites. But I think there's something to be said. We were a bit hesitant to put the gold weights into the exhibition. So this has been a huge part of our research process. But, you know, a lot of these works are like the size of an American quarter or smaller. And so it's really hard to get the kind of process of looking them. Like, you do have to get up close to them. So what we've done is we've put about 20 of them on display so that you can see a lot of visual range, as well as placed a magnifying glass over one of them so that you can really see those details. And so if you're able to come, I do invite you, don't skip over those gold weights. Take a good look. There's a lot of interesting material elements to them. Like you can even see here in the picture, we've got some welcome numbers that you can see at that top one on the right. It's 6149, I think 6199, as well as the one that's on the face. And so you can really see a lot from looking at these close. So don't get too distracted by the giant post that's next to it, and take time to look at the small things as well.
Thank you. Okay, and someone's wondering if you could please talk about one of the more frustrating dead ends in the Provenance research.
Oh my gosh, could we ever? So we'd like to remind everyone when we're talking about the Welcome Project that these are the most exciting cases that we could come up with, the most illustrative, the things that can really show a lot of different themes. But we have included, you know, the axe, the headrest, and the post as examples of where the research just stops. And unfortunately, this is a reality for a lot of research on collections that were formed in the early 20th century. There's this lack of records. And so it's requiring a really creative approach to provenance research that's combining these ideas of collaboration across many different academic fields, as well as with the community, and really forcing us to think creatively about how we can both consider the past of these objects as well as their futures.
Thank you. And speaking of futures, Dan Wunderlich is wondering if, well, he first says this is an important and interesting project and congratulations. And then he wonders how you hope the stories of the past will help shape the proper stewardship of collections now and into the future.
Oh, thanks, Dan. Thanks for coming. It's great to see you on the internet. So proper stewardship is a real question. So what do we mean by that? Are we talking only about the care of these objects in collections? Are we talking about how they're interpreted? And that's really what we're seeing as a next step of this project. Provenance research is the first step. You know, I maybe not have said it in this talk, but for a large portion of the Wellcome collection in our database when we started, it was just listed as Africa or West Africa. And so we have to be able to build these stories that allow us to get back to, like, for the mask, Abeokuta, like an actual city where you can create these connections. And so we think about stewardship both in terms of the care and preservation of an object, as well as its future interpretation, ownership, all those different kinds of things. But what we really wanted to highlight in this exhibition is that you got to start with the provenance. You have to think about what's available, what creative ways you can get back to some kind of specificity about these works, and then share them so that we can address those important questions moving forward.
Thank you. All right, so we have a more specific question about something in one of the info cards. And I'm wondering if Denton is a unique enough name that you could be sure enough which Denton it was referring to, and might there be any other Dentons connected to the mask that you mentioned?
We are kind of sure, maybe. It's always a big maybe, sure, probably, kind of, maybe. Denton, George C. Denton. But there are quite a few of Dentons that we've been able to, you kind of search around with like a personal made algorithm in your head. So this style of mask is something that we consider as coming from Nigeria. And so you search for if there's any Dentons appearing in Nigerian newspapers or accounts of British people, since the British were in control of Nigeria at that time or trying to establish control. If there are Dentons traveling with the military or for merchants or different kinds of trade, or were they working for the railroad or any other kind of Denton. And this George C. Denton kept coming up again and again in the archives with his role as the colonial secretary. He also served as the acting governor for a year or two, where the acting governor had to step away from the region. So his name comes up again and again, and we know from different speeches that he gave that he was in Abeokuta a couple of times, as well as facilitating different kinds of agreements with the leaders in that area. Agreements, said lightly. But there, so I'm like mostly confident that it is George C. Denton, just given the circumstances, but there is a large possibility that it could have been his wife who actually collected this piece. She did give some pieces to the Pitt Rivers Museum that you can see in the story map. But it seems like her collecting was more related to botanical specimens that have been given to like the British Museum via Kew Gardens, as well as, I mean, she was still alive at this time, but she did die in 1902, I think. So by 1911, it's kind of this joint ownership. She might have collected it, but then it was in George's possession when it was sold. And so I'm pretty sure that it was this George C. Denton, but there are a number of other possibilities. We have record of a N.C. Denton who was in the Benin Kingdom in the 1930s. I don't know when he arrived. He is not really referenced all that much in archive sources. He's just listed as N.C. Denton, resident of Benin. So I don't know what that means. We need to do a lot more archive work, but given the circumstances, it seems fairly likely that it is this George C. Denton, but we can never be 100% positive.
Thank you. That's wow. It's really interesting to hear all these little details that are part of the equation here. So I've got an interesting question also related to the mask. So they note that you were able to locate the mask geographically and find a similar mask as far as a theme. Were you able to find a hand for the post or to locate it within the Yoruba region?
Yeah, so thanks. That research is ongoing. So we have a note from Robert Ferris Thompson that this was from a specific town in Ekiti State, I think, in Nigeria. And so that does give us quite a bit to go on where we could connect with these communities. But I don't think that Thompson gave us a specific hand for this. But I know you, Robin, if you know, will you please tell me? Or if you know of any archives I can look in. We've really, I mean, so like that's another part of this exhibition. This research will be ongoing. And so as things come to be updated, we'll continue to update those story maps and share as we can, possibly maybe on the Athaller's Instagram or other avenues. But that's one kind of joy of working on this project and sharing it with multiple venues is that, you know, until I think it was like a week ago, we didn't know about the Cleveland Museum of Art mask. And when the publication for this event went out, someone emailed me and they said, hey, I've seen something similar like that. You should look at it. And so it prompted this whole conversation about the workshop, about the comparison of the styles, about the possible use. Is it Egungun Society? Is it Oro Society? And so it's really kind of ongoing.
Thank you. John Monroe wonders, he's been super interested in learning more about how it is that colonial administrators and other European visitors bought objects in Africa. And he's wondering if you've been able to find any specific accounts of how these purchases might have worked, that is, of specific instances of buying and selling.
Thanks, John, for that. And thanks for coming. So it's not including in this exhibition, but we have a specific case of MDW Jeffries, who was a colonial administrator also working in Nigeria, who was commissioned by Wellcome to purchase a number of objects. I think there's like maybe a few hundred of objects that he collected that are in Pitt Rivers and a few at the Fowler. And so we have a little bit of insight about what he was collecting. We have this really remarkable letter in which he writes to Wellcome of, oh, we know that you don't want to collect this fake made for the market stuff, fake made for the market. But then in the literal next sentence, he's writing, we know, but sometimes the really authentic things are not available. So is it okay if I purchase you something that's a replica made to my taste? And so we see this interesting interplay of him saying, I know you don't want what's made for the market, but my discerning eye as an expert of this area, I can get produced for you something that really replicates something that is used. And so the Jeffries case is really intriguing about how he was maybe interacting with different communities. But there, I mean, the details are also still kind of vague. Like we're not sure always who he was working with. And then in another case, we do have a lady collector, Winifred Blackman, who was working in Egypt, and she provided, we have less of a feel of her interaction with the communities, but she did record the names of people she was buying from, the towns in which she was buying from, and how much she paid in some instances, as well as a record of what that person said that the work was used for. So she collected a lot of amulets and musical instruments, largely from women. And so that's another case of an interesting specifics that we have of how these interactions were taking place. But it's pretty rare, and it's something that we're really trying to seek out in other ways.
Thank you. So Rachel Tabori wonders if you collaborate with American or international museums to research provenance. Is there collaboration between museums?
Oh, absolutely. Collaboration is our favorite word. So we are working, we're building up our facilitation of communication. As you know, COVID like really shut things down, and we moved everything on the internet. So that made it a lot easier to think about how we're collaborating across the ocean. We're in contact with our colleagues at the Wellcome Trust on at least a weekly basis, if not multiple times a week, about different questions that we're encountering, if they can help us find anything. As well as thinking about all the different institutions that received material from the Wellcome Trust. So the Fowler is quite unique in that we did receive that archive of the flimsy cards. And so we're able to really kind of provide a model of how you work with that information, whereas other institutions, they didn't receive a lot of the flimsy cards. So they're relying on those numbers that are written in on the objects. And you have to figure out, is it an A number? Is it an R number? Is it the SL notation? Which ones are welcome? Which ones come before? And so we're starting to really communicate with the UK institutions as well as the African-based institutions to think about researching welcome as a whole. And from there, we hope to really grow these provenance discussions. Of course, the Fowler is participating in various collaborative working methods in African art to think about provenance as a process. So yeah, collaboration is key.
All right, this is the last question we have time for today from Elaine Sullivan. She says, thank you so much. And she wonders if you found that objects collected in certain areas are more likely to be better documented than others.
Great question, Elaine, thanks. So we do have, I mean, it's pretty characteristic of collections from the early 20th century to have a large focus on Nigerian and Congo collections. But because we have these kind of meticulous records that Wellcome have, it's pretty across the board, these auction records or the collection records that he has. Yes, a lot of them came from Nigeria and Congo, but in terms of getting it beyond the auction or the collector, it pretty much is pretty even about where it just stops. So it could be Stevens 1919, and then you get back to the auction catalog and it's, we don't know. The exception to this is, of course, there's always an exception to every rule, is the material that's billed as being taken in a military expedition. So these are pieces that even in the early 20th century were gaining a lot of lore. They were gaining a lot of value because they were collected in these high risk situations. So then I can refer you to the Throne, and it's kind of fabricated military expedition that it was taken during, and you can explore more of it there. But these like high risk situations are the ones where in the auction catalogs it'll most likely be referenced. So kind of like we saw with the mask, it was said to have been taken during this expedition, and so that allows us to get one step beyond the auction or the collector, but it's pretty bleak out there most of the time.
Well, thanks again for everything today, Carlee, for taking the time to put together this presentation and answer these questions for us. And I know that we have a program coming up with you later this month at the museum, and you're going to be giving a walkthrough of the exhibition. And I'm just looking up the date for that really quickly. We have you leading a tour at the museum on the 24th, Sunday at 1 o'clock. So no registration required, registration's encouraged. If you want to come, please come. And in the meantime, I just want to let you know that this program's been recorded. It will be available immediately on the Fowler's Facebook, and in a few days it'll be on our Instagram and our website for you to revisit and share. And we hope that you'll join us again for our next program. Details can be found on the closing slide. In the meantime, have a great evening. We'll see you next time. Bye.